You know that feeling when a story clings to you, lingering in your mind long after it's been told. Well, this one will haunt you. You see, sometimes the dead aren't the only ones lingering in cemeteries. Sometimes the living, those with unfinished business, leave their mark too. And sometimes those we think are alive are not quite what they seem. My name is Tom Harris. I've been working as a cemetery caretaker here in Baltimore for nearly 20 years. But the story I'm about to share with you, it's the one that still gives me chills every time I think about it. This isn't your typical ghost story. It's real, and it happened to me. It all started on a breezy autumn afternoon. The leaves were falling in golden showers, and the cemetery was as peaceful as it gets. That's when I saw her for the first time. She was a striking woman, dressed entirely in black. Her long dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes were filled with a sorrow so deep that even the cold gravestones seemed warmer. I didn't want to intrude. It's not my place to disturb mourners. But I couldn't help but notice her sobbing over a tombstone. It looked plain, unmarked, almost as if whoever lay beneath it had been forgotten by the world. The sight of her pain, her shaking shoulders, it pulled at something deep within me. Yet I stayed silent, watching from a distance, letting her grief remain her own. Little did I know that wouldn't be the last time I'd see her. A week passed, and as the days grew shorter, I found myself thinking about her. When Saturday rolled around, there she was again, right on time. The woman in black. She stood by that same nameless grave, tears streaming down her pale face. The scene was as haunting as the first time I'd witnessed it. But this time, curiosity got the better of me. After she left, I approached the grave she had been mourning over. My boots crunched against the fallen leaves as I stepped closer. My heart pounded for reasons I couldn't explain. I knelt down, expecting to find some small detail I'd missed before. A name, a date, something. But there was nothing. No name, no inscription. Just a nameless, forgotten tombstone. "Who are you mourning?" I whispered into the empty air, as if the dead could whisper back. But there was only silence. The question nagged at me, following me as I worked. What was her connection to this grave? Why did she seem so heartbroken over someone who had apparently no identity? I tried to push it from my mind, but it lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Little did I know, that shadow was just the beginning. The next Saturday arrived, and with it, a gloomy, overcast sky that made the air thick with something I could only describe as dread. As I walked through the rows of gravestones, I spotted her again. The woman in black. Her presence had become almost routine, and yet every time I saw her, I felt that same gnawing sense of unease. But this time, I couldn't just stand by and watch. I had to know more. I had to understand why she was so fixated on that nameless grave. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I approached her, my heart thumping so loud I was sure she'd hear it. "Ma'am?" I called out softly, trying not to startle her. She didn't look up. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, and the sound was like knives scraping against my soul. I stepped closer, the crisp leaves beneath my feet betraying my approach. "Ma'am," I said again, a little louder this time. Finally, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale, as if she hadn't seen the sun in years. Up close, she seemed younger than I'd first thought, maybe in her early 30s. There was a fragility about her, but also something else, something darker. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Who are you mourning?" I asked, my voice cracking a little. "I've noticed you here every week, and I can't help but wonder." I stopped, feeling ridiculous. Who was I to question a grieving woman? She studied me for a moment, her gaze sharp, almost as if she were looking through me rather than at me. Then she wiped her tears and spoke, her voice quiet yet full of an unbearable sadness. "I have no family, no friends. Just like the one buried here, she whispered, gesturing to the nameless grave. One day, I'll be like them, forgotten, alone. Her words sent a chill through me, but there was something even more unsettling about the way she said them. It felt like a confession, a prophecy, and a curse all wrapped into one. I'm sorry, I managed to say. It felt like the only appropriate response, though it barely scratched the surface of her grief. Before I could ask more, she turned and walked away, disappearing through the iron gates of the cemetery. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to process everything she'd said. The way she spoke about being forgotten, it felt too real, too certain. I was left with more questions than answers, but there was something about her that I couldn't shake. The following Monday, I was back at work, raking leaves and doing my usual rounds, when the cemetery manager, Mr. Carlson, approached me. He was a stout man with a bristly moustache, always dressed in a crisp suit, even when surrounded by the dead. Today, though, his face was pulled into a tight frown. "Tom," he started, his voice gruff, "we have a problem." I set down my rake and wiped the sweat from my brow. "What's going on, Mr. Carlson?" He sighed, looking out over the cemetery with a stern expression. "We're running out of space," he said. "New bodies coming in, but we've got no room. I need you to clear out that old nameless grave in the northwest corner." My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly which grave he was talking about, the one that woman visited every week. "Wait, Mr. Carlson," I protested. "Someone still visits that grave. A woman every week." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A nameless grave isn't doing us any good. And if it's really that important to her, she should have put up a marker years ago. We need that space." I felt a pang of guilt and dread. How could I disturb a grave that clearly meant so much to someone? But Mr. Carlson was the boss, and his orders were final. There was nothing I could do to change his mind. "Look, just get it done," he added, already turning to leave. "We have a new body coming in tomorrow, and it needs a proper burial." I watched him walk away, feeling an immense sense of helplessness. The idea of disturbing that grave, of betraying the woman's grief, gnawed at me, but I had a job to do. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery, I knew I couldn't avoid it. That night, I barely slept. Thoughts of the woman, her sorrow, and the grave that held no name haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The next morning, the sky was an unsettling grey, thick with the promise of rain. I arrived at the cemetery feeling a heavy sense of dread, the kind that clings to your bones. Mr. Carlson's orders rang in my ears, echoing with a finality I couldn't escape. I gathered my tools and made my way to the nameless grave, my hands trembling. As I stood over it, shovel in hand, I hesitated. The woman's words replayed in my mind. One day, I'll be like them, forgotten, alone. It felt wrong, as if I was about to disturb not just the earth, but something deeper, something that should remain buried. I took a deep breath and plunged the shovel into the dirt. With each scoop, my heart pounded louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The grave was older than I thought, and the dirt was hard-packed, stubbornly clinging to the past. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I hit the coffin. The sound was a hollow, unsettling echo that sent shivers down my spine. I swallowed hard and wiped the sweat from my brow. The coffin looked ancient, the wood splintered and decaying. With shaking hands, I pried it open, my breath caught in my throat. The coffin was empty. Panic surged through me, cold and relentless. How could it be empty? Who or what had been buried here? The world spun around me, and I staggered back, dropping the shovel. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there she was, the woman in black. Only now she wasn't crying. She stood eerily still, her eyes void of the sorrow I had once seen. Instead, There was a chilling emptiness, a quiet acceptance of something far darker. My voice cracked as I tried to speak. Why is it empty?" I managed to whisper. She tilted her head slightly, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Because," she said softly, "it's waiting for me." The words made my blood run cold. Suddenly, I heard the creak of the cemetery gate. Mr. Carlson's voice called out, echoing through the graveyard. "Tom, they've brought the new body. Get ready!" I glanced back at the woman, but she was already walking toward the cemetery entrance. The pallbearers carried a coffin toward the newly opened grave, and as they set it down, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Mr. Carlson approached, oblivious to my horror. He motioned for me to open the new coffin. My hands were ice cold as I fumbled with the latches. The lid creaked open, revealing the lifeless body of the woman in black, her face peaceful, as if she had known all along this was where she was meant to be. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. I stumbled back, my mind racing. How could she be here, lifeless, when I had just seen her standing mere moments ago? The world seemed to close in, suffocating and surreal. I heard Mr. Carlson's voice, muffled and distant, asking if I was all right. But I couldn't answer. I couldn't explain what had happened because some things defy explanation. As they lowered her body into the grave, I realized the truth. The woman in black had been both mourner and the mourned, a ghost haunting her own unmarked tomb. And I, the caretaker, had become part of her unfinished story. Some say cemeteries are for the dead, but I've learned that sometimes they hold the living too. Those who are trapped, lost and forgotten, waiting for someone to finally lay them to rest. They say some flowers shouldn't be taken, and if you do, they'll come running back for you, literally. My mom learned this the hard way. My name is Chris, and today I'm here to share with you a terrifying story that happened to my mom when she was young. Before we dive in, let me tell you, this isn't just any ghost story. It's a story about the one time my mom made a mistake that haunted her, and it involves a flower that shouldn't have ever left its grave. I grew up hearing my mom's voice shake whenever she told this story, and even now I get chills thinking about it. So, sit back, relax, or maybe you shouldn't relax too much, because what you're about to hear could make you think twice before you take anything from a place meant for the dead. All right, let's rewind to when my mom, Emily, was around 19 years old. Back then, she spent a lot of time visiting a quiet cemetery in Savannah, Georgia. It wasn't just any cemetery, it was where her older sister, Mary, was buried. Mary had tragically taken her own life, and the family had never fully recovered from it. My mom visited the grave every week, hoping to feel some connection, some sense of peace. The cemetery was an odd blend of sadness and beauty. Ancient oak trees stretched their limbs like guardian spirits over the gravestones, and wildflowers bloomed everywhere, as if nature was trying to soften the grief that lingered in the air. My mom would sit by her sister's grave, sometimes talking, sometimes just feeling the silence wrap around her. But one visit stood out, a visit she would never forget. She noticed a different grave nearby, one covered in the most vibrant, eye-catching flowers she had ever seen. The petals glowed in the afternoon sun, almost like they were alive, and something about them drew her in. She didn't know then that these flowers had a guardian, and disturbing them would mean facing something she never wanted to believe existed. My mom, Emily, couldn't help but feel curious. The grave belonged to someone named Thomas Barker, who had passed away in 1927. It was clear that no one had tended to it in a long time, yet these flowers seemed so full of life. Driven by this strange, irresistible pull, she knelt down by the grave and examined the blossoms. They were a bright, mesmerizing purple, unlike any flowers she'd ever seen. Without thinking too much, she whispered, "Mr. Barker, if it's all right with you, I'd like to take one of these flowers home." A breeze rustled through the trees, almost like a response, but my mom brushed off the eerie feeling that crept up her spine. Carefully, she picked a small, delicate bloom and tucked it into her bag, not realizing she had just disturbed something beyond her understanding. When she got home, she planted the flower in a clay pot, giving it water and sunlight. To her surprise, it grew rapidly, blooming even more vibrantly. It was almost like the flower was happy to be there. But strange things started happening. It wasn't just the way the flower seemed to thrive unnaturally well. It was the way shadows moved in the corners of the room, or how the air felt colder when you stood too close to the pot. The turning point came when her older sister, Aunt Linda, came to visit. Aunt Linda had always been sensitive to the supernatural, and she didn't like to mess around with things that felt off. The moment she stepped inside the house, she froze. Her eyes landed on the potted flower, and she went pale. That night, Aunt Linda would wake the entire household with a blood-curdling scream, claiming she had seen something running toward the flower. But what she saw wasn't human. And that's where I'll leave it for now. If you want to know what Aunt Linda saw, and how this story spiraled into something even darker, make sure you're subscribed and have liked this video. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. My mom said the scream that came from Aunt Linda's room that night was something she'd never forget. It sliced through the quiet house like a knife, sending everyone scrambling out of their beds. Aunt Linda was standing in the middle of her room, her hands shaking, eyes wide with a terror that seemed to freeze her in place. My mum rushed to her side, trying to calm her down, but Aunt Linda kept pointing toward the door, muttering something under her breath. "It was running. Just legs, nothing else," Aunt Linda managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "It came straight for the flower." The room fell silent. My mom felt a chill wash over her, a cold that seemed to seep into her bones. Aunt Linda turned to face her, her eyes full of desperation. "Emily, what did you bring into this house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. At that moment, my mom knew something was seriously wrong. It wasn't just a harmless flower from a forgotten grave. It was something connected to whatever lay beneath the dirt, something that didn't want to be disturbed. My mom tried to reassure everyone, but even she couldn't ignore the creeping sense of dread that had taken hold of the house. Over the next few days, the uneasiness only grew. The flower seemed to be thriving, its petals glowing with an unnatural vibrancy, but the house felt haunted. Doors creaked open on their own, whispers echoed through empty rooms, and shadows moved where no shadows should be. One night, my mum swore she saw the silhouette of a man standing by the flower pot. She blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling of being watched never left her. My mum couldn't take it anymore. She knew she had to do something before whatever was haunting them became too powerful to stop. Aunt Linda, still pale and shaken from her encounter, begged her to get rid of the flower. But how? Was it even that simple? My mum decided she had to return the flower to the cemetery and make things right, no matter how terrifying the thought was. The question was, would the spirit let her go that easily? The night my mum decided to return the flower was one she describes as the longest, most nerve-wracking night of her life. She waited until the next afternoon, hoping the daylight would somehow protect her from whatever might be lurking in the cemetery. But even as the sun shone brightly, an ominous weight hung over her, like the air was thick with an unseen presence. She put the clay pot with the flower in the back seat of her old Ford, feeling her heart race with every mile she drove toward the cemetery. Aunt Linda sat in the passenger seat, clutching a rosary and whispering prayers under her breath. Neither of them spoke much, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. When they finally arrived at the cemetery, my mum hesitated. The place looked the same as ever, peaceful and quiet, but now she knew better. She knew that not everything resting here was truly at peace. With shaky hands, she picked up the pot and made her way to the grave where she had found the flower. The grave of Thomas Barker stood there, as unassuming as ever, but my mum felt an undeniable sense of unease. She knelt down and placed the flower back on the grave, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to disturb you. Please take back what's yours and leave us alone." Aunt Linda stood a few feet away, her knuckles white from gripping the rosary so tightly. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the whole scene feel even more unsettling. My mum held her breath, waiting, praying that the spirit would accept her apology and let them leave in peace. For a moment nothing happened. The air was still, and the cemetery seemed almost too quiet. Then a gust of wind swept through, carrying with it a low, mournful sound like a sigh from the earth itself. The petals of the flower shivered, and my mum felt a strange warmth wash over her, as if something had finally let go. But Aunt Linda wasn't convinced. She kept her eyes on the grave, murmuring prayers, until my mum gently pulled her away. As they walked back to the car, my mum couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but she didn't look back. Aunt Linda stayed silent until they were safely back on the road, and only then did she whisper, "You did the right thing." But even after returning the flower, my mom said she could never look at cemetery flowers the same way again. The weight of that experience changed her forever, and she swore never to take anything from the dead again. Even though the flower was returned to where it belonged, the haunting memories of that time never really left my mom. She described it as a feeling that would sneak up on her in quiet moments, a shiver down her spine, a whisper in the wind that reminded her of the power and mystery of what she had encountered. Aunt Linda, who had always been the family's spiritual anchor, often reminded everyone of the importance of respecting the dead. But life slowly returned to normal. The house felt lighter, and the cold shadows that once lurked in the corners seemed to have disappeared. My mum tried to go about her daily routine as if nothing had happened, but she couldn't bring herself to visit the cemetery as often as she used to. The experience had left a mark, one that would never fully heal. One day, years later, I asked her if she ever regretted picking that flower. She gave me a sad smile and said, "It wasn't just about the flower. It was about respect. Cemeteries are places of rest, and taking something from there is like disturbing someone's sleep." Her words stuck with me, a chilling reminder of how thin the veil between the living and the dead can be. She'd tell me that every time she saw a flower in a cemetery, she couldn't help but wonder about the spirit attached to it, the life it once represented. And to this day, she refuses to take anything, even a petal, from a grave. The fear had turned into a deep, abiding respect for the dead and for the things we don't fully understand. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's to be careful, to think twice before taking what doesn't belong to you. Or maybe it's to never underestimate the power of the unseen. My mum's story became a cautionary tale in our family, one that I've shared with you now, hoping it makes you think twice too. And hey, if you've made it this far and enjoy these eerie tales, consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. There are plenty more stories where this one came from, each one stranger and scarier than the last. Who knows? The next story might just keep you up at night. You know, there are some things that stick with you forever, like shadows that never fade. For me, it's the memory of that night, the night I almost felt death push me over the edge. But let me take you back so you can see how it all began. Trust me, you'll want to hear this one to the end. Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm just your average woman who grew up in a small town in Illinois. But what I'm about to share isn't so average. It's a haunting memory from my childhood, a terrifying experience that still makes me shiver. And it all started with my sweet, old grandma and our routine visits to the cemetery. My grandma, Margaret, was the kindest woman you'd ever meet, always smelling like lavender and carrying an old wicker basket full of cleaning supplies. Every Sunday, we'd visit the Evergreen Memorial Cemetery to tend to the graves of my great-grandparents. The cemetery was peaceful, with its long rows of headstones and towering oak trees, but to a kid, it felt eerie, like something was always lurking behind the shadows. Grandma never seemed to notice. She'd whistle old folk songs while trimming weeds and polishing the headstones, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The way the wind whispered through the trees, the shadows that seemed to move on their own, it all made my skin crawl. But everything changed one afternoon. It was a sunny fall day, and the air smelled of fallen leaves. I was running around helping Grandma like always when I tripped on a loose rock. In an instant, my legs slipped and I plunged one foot into an open grave. My heart raced, and a chill unlike any I'd ever felt crept up my spine. It was as if something deep down in that dark pit wanted to pull me under. Grandma rushed over, her hands shaking as she pulled me out. I tried to laugh it off, but I'll never forget the cold, empty stare from the darkness below. And that was just the beginning of my nightmare. After that day, something changed. At first, it was subtle. I couldn't fall asleep without thinking about that grave and the cold sensation that had wrapped around my leg. But soon, the nightmares began. Nightmares that felt so real, I'd wake up drenched in sweat. In my dreams, a pale man would stand among the tombstones, wearing a tattered black coat and a twisted grin. His eyes were hollow, yet I could feel them piercing right through me. Every night, he'd say the same thing. "Amanda, I know you. I'm waiting." His voice was like the whisper of autumn leaves rustling, but never loud enough for anyone else to hear. I didn't tell anyone at first. I mean, how do you explain to people that a man from your dreams is haunting you? But the nightmares began to take a toll. I became jumpy, distracted, and even my parents started to notice. One night, though, everything escalated to a whole new level. I was in the middle of one of those horrible dreams, standing frozen in the cemetery as the man got closer and closer. Suddenly I felt a push, an invisible force shoving me forward. The next thing I knew, I woke up, nearly tumbling down the stairs of our two-story house. My dad caught me just in time, his face pale with shock. I was shaking, tears streaming down my face. It felt like the nightmare had followed me into the real world, and I couldn't escape. And that's when I knew this wasn't just in my head. Something or someone was trying to hurt me. After that incident on the stairs, life became a waking nightmare. I was constantly on edge, feeling as though something sinister lingered just out of sight. Even the comfort of my own home felt corrupted, like shadows were thicker and the air heavier. My parents grew increasingly worried, watching me with furrowed brows and whispered conversations when they thought I wasn't listening. My mom, Susan, tried to get me to talk. "Amanda, honey, are you sure everything's okay?" she'd ask, her eyes searching mine. I wanted to tell her everything, the man in the nightmares, the feeling of being watched, but I was terrified of sounding crazy. Instead, I forced a smile and said I was just tired. But sleep wasn't safe either. Every time I drifted off, the pale man was there, watching from the graves, and each night he came closer, whispering, "I'm waiting, Amanda. You can't escape." The dreams became more vivid, and I could feel the chill of the cemetery air and smell the damp earth. One time I even woke up with dirt on my hands, as if I'd been digging my own grave. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was it just a nightmare, or was something from the other side truly reaching for me? One evening, Grandma Margaret invited us over for dinner. She'd noticed my change too, and tried to cheer me up with stories of her childhood and my favorite apple pie. The warmth of her small, cozy house was a welcome escape from the fear that haunted me. But as we sat around the table, Grandma's smile faded and her eyes grew serious. "You know," she said softly, "there are spirits that linger, Amanda. I've seen things myself." She looked at me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "Sometimes, when we disturb their rest, they don't let us forget. Has anything happened, dear?" I froze, my heart pounding. My mind raced back to the grave, the icy darkness, and the man who now haunted my dreams. Grandma seemed to read the fear on my face and reached for my hand. Her touch was warm, but her voice held a warning. "If something is following you," she whispered, "we need to do something about it. Spirits don't just go away on their own." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was plagued by what Grandma had said. Was I being haunted because I had disturbed the grave? The thought kept me wide awake, my eyes fixed on the shadows dancing in the corners of my room. The next morning, my parents, finally convinced something was seriously wrong, decided to take me to see Father Thomas, the local priest at St. Mary's Church. He was a calm, wise man who had been in the community for years. As we sat in his quiet office, surrounded by the scent of old wood and candles, I felt a mixture of hope and dread. Father Thomas listened patiently as I told him everything. The cemetery visits with Grandma, the accident with the grave, and the man who haunted my dreams. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes seemed to grow darker with each detail. When I finally finished, he sat in silence for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "This is not the first time I've heard of restless spirits," he finally said. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to his words. "Sometimes, when the dead feel disrespected or disturbed, they try to reach out to the living. It's rare, but it happens. And it sounds like you've caught the attention of one of these spirits." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do I do?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The idea that a spirit had fixated on me made my skin crawl, and the room felt colder. Father Thomas leaned forward, his eyes kind but serious. "First, we need to make sure you don't return to that cemetery," he said. "Going back could strengthen its hold on you. Then I'll perform a blessing to cleanse you of this presence." He paused, a small smile breaking through the seriousness. "And you know, Amanda, if you found this story as captivating as it is terrifying, it wouldn't hurt to subscribe to the channel and like the video. After all, you never know what you might learn next." Despite the fear clutching my heart, his attempt to lighten the moment made me smile slightly. But the weight of his warning was clear. Something supernatural had latched onto me, and it wasn't going to let go easily. That evening, Father Thomas performed the blessing. It was a solemn ceremony with prayers, holy water, and the lingering scent of burning incense. My parents watched anxiously, holding hands, as the priest invoked protection over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of peace. When it was over, Father Thomas placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Stay strong, Amanda," he said. "Sometimes it takes more than one blessing to rid yourself of a determined spirit. But you are not alone. We'll face this together." As we left the church, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the pale man lurking in the shadows. But there was only the setting sun, casting long golden rays across the world. Maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was finally coming to an end. I wish I could tell you that everything went back to normal after Father Thomas's blessing. For a few days, it really did feel like the nightmare was over. I slept without being haunted by the pale man, and the air in our house seemed lighter, almost like a heavy fog had lifted. My parents began to relax, and even Grandma Margaret looked relieved when I visited her. But peace has a way of tricking you into thinking you're safe, and I was about to learn that lesson the hard way. 1 week after the blessing, I woke up in the dead of night, my heart pounding. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the air. I sat up, and there he was, the pale man standing at the foot of my bed. His hollow eyes gleamed and a cruel smile twisted his lips. This time, he didn't whisper. His voice was a chilling growl, echoing in the stillness of my room. "You thought you could escape me?" he sneered, stepping closer. "You're mine now." I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body was paralyzed with terror, and I felt that icy grip around my leg again, the same one I'd felt in the grave. His hand reached out and the room spun. I was falling like the darkness had opened up beneath me, and all I could think was that this was the end. But then, something extraordinary happened. A sudden warmth flooded the room, and a voice, my grandmother's voice, filled the air. "Leave her alone," it commanded, strong and unwavering. The pale man recoiled, his eyes wide with disbelief. The warmth grew brighter, surrounding me, and I realized it was coming from a figure standing beside my bed. It was Grandma Margaret, or at least some protective spirit of hers. She was glowing with a golden light, and her presence made the darkness retreat. The pale man let out a furious, inhuman shriek before vanishing into the shadows. The room returned to normal, the warmth fading but leaving behind a sense of safety. I collapsed onto the bed, tears streaming down my face, and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." The next morning I told my family everything. Grandma Margaret held me close, her eyes shining with both worry and love. "You're protected, Amanda," she said softly. "Sometimes the love of those who have passed is stronger than any spirit that tries to harm you." From that day on, the nightmares never returned. I never went back to the cemetery, and my life slowly settled back into its old, familiar rhythm. But I knew things would never be quite the same. The experience had left its mark on me, a reminder that there are forces in this world we don't understand. But it also taught me about the power of love, the kind that even the dead can use to keep us safe. And that's my story, a terrifying journey that still makes my heart race, but one that left me stronger and more aware of the unseen world around us. If you made it this far, maybe you should consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. After all, there are many more stories like mine, some even more haunting, and you won't want to miss them. If you ever think cemeteries are just places for the dead, you might change your mind after hearing what happened to my friend. Because sometimes things we disturb from their rest can make the living pay a price. Hi there, and welcome to this chilling story that's still etched in my memory. My name is Michael, and I'm a retired police officer. But today, I'm not here to talk about crime or the law. Instead, I'm going to share a terrifying experience from my childhood in a neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia, an event that even the toughest skeptics have struggled to explain. When I was a kid, there wasn't much to do in our neighborhood except find creative ways to pass the time with my friends. One of my closest friends back then was Jake. Jake was a wild spirit, always full of energy and laughter. We'd race our bikes down every street, play games until the sun disappeared, and sneak around places we probably shouldn't have. But one particular place always gave me the creeps: the old cemetery on Maplewood Street. Our neighborhood had its fair share of ghost stories, but the cemetery had the worst reputation. It was surrounded by cracked stone walls, overgrown ivy, and graves so ancient that some headstones were worn smooth. Still, Jake and I thought we were invincible. That's until something happened that changed everything. Jake, the fearless prankster, got really sick, and I'm not talking about a simple fever or a bad cold. One day he was fine, and the next he was bedridden, sweating and shaking like he'd been cursed. No medicine seemed to help, and he only got worse. Everyone in the neighborhood whispered about it, but no one had any answers. Stay with me, because you'll want to hear what happened next. The day Jake got sick had started like any other. We were running around, trying to find something exciting to do. The old cemetery, of course, came up in conversation. I hesitated, but Jake, being Jake, couldn't resist the idea of testing our courage there. That's when things took a turn for the worse. The cemetery loomed over us as we pushed the rusty gate open. It creaked so loudly I was sure the dead could hear us. We wandered around for a bit, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet, and then Jake did something I'll never forget. He found an old, broken crown of funeral flowers lying near a grave. With a mischievous grin, he picked up the metal hoop that once held the flowers and rolled it like a toy down the path. He was laughing, and I was about to join in when a sudden gust of cold wind swept through, chilling me to the bone. It wasn't just the wind, it was the way the air felt heavy, like we'd crossed some unseen line. Jake laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We left the cemetery soon after, but that night, Jake's illness began. His parents were worried sick, and the doctors couldn't make sense of it. All the neighborhood kids, myself included, were scared out of our minds. We kept asking, what happened to Jake? But deep down, I feared the answer had something to do with that old grave and the object he had disturbed. If you're curious about the rest of this haunting tale and how Jake's fate unfolded, trust me, you'll want to hear every chilling detail. Jake's condition didn't improve. Days went by, and instead of bouncing back, he only seemed to get worse. His once vibrant laughter was replaced with whispers of pain, and he lay there, pale and weak, as if something invisible was draining the life out of him. His parents had tried everything, from doctors to specialists, but no one had answers. That's when Jake's mom, Mrs. Henderson, decided to take a desperate step. It was one evening, as the sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, that Jake's mother, clutching her rosary, made her way to a nearby spiritual center. I remember my mom telling me how Mrs. Henderson's face looked hollow, like she hadn't slept in days, but her eyes burned with a fierce determination to save her son. The spiritual center was an unassuming building on the outside, but inside it was a place thick with the scent of incense, filled with candles and eerie quiet. Mrs. Henderson sat in front of a woman who was said to have a gift. The room was dimly lit, and the woman's voice was calm but commanding. She asked Mrs. Henderson to explain Jake's sudden illness. As she listened, her eyes narrowed with a sort of recognition, and then she spoke in a voice that seemed to chill the room. "Your son," she said, "has offended the spirits of the grave. He took something that didn't belong to him." Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled, but she remembered. The memory of Jake rolling that funeral crown down the path in the cemetery came flooding back. The spiritual guide continued, "The object must be returned, and only then will the spirit be appeased. If it isn't, the boy's life will continue to fade." I remember hearing this story and feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. Mrs. Henderson didn't waste a second. She rushed home, her heart pounding, and told Jake's father everything. With urgency, they planned to return the object the very next day. The rest of us kids waited anxiously, unsure if this spiritual ritual could really make a difference, but desperately hoping it would. And hey, if this story is gripping you like it did me, now's a great time to hit that like button and subscribe. You don't want to miss what comes next. The next morning was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something is watching you. Jake's dad carried the funeral crown, its metal glinting under the pale morning light, as he and Mrs. Henderson made their way to the cemetery. I followed from a distance, curiosity and fear battling inside me. I needed to see for myself how this would end. When they arrived at the cemetery, the atmosphere felt different. The air was colder, and the old grave seemed even more overgrown and twisted, like they'd come alive overnight. Mrs. Henderson approached the grave where Jake had found the crown. She knelt, whispering a tearful apology, and carefully placed the metal ring back where it belonged. I could barely breathe as I watched. The moment she placed the crown, a breeze stirred the leaves, but instead of the harsh, chilling wind from before, it felt lighter, almost peaceful. The change wasn't just in the wind. The entire cemetery seemed to let out a sigh, as if the spirits had finally been appeased. Mrs. Henderson stood, her eyes glistening with hope, and we all held our breath, waiting for some sign that Jake would be okay. And then, like a miracle, he was. Within hours, Jake started to recover. The color came back to his cheeks, and he could finally sit up, weak but smiling. It was as if whatever had gripped him so tightly had finally let go. The doctors couldn't explain it, but I knew. We all knew. Jake was alive because his family had listened, because they had shown respect to the spirits of the dead. Even now, years later, as I walk past that same cemetery, I don't dare disturb a thing. Some places, some spirits demand respect, and if there's one thing I learned from that chilling experience, it's that the dead have their own way of making sure we never forget.